Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Broyles, and of course, I'm your professor at Carroll Community College. And for this particular screencast, we're going to walk through a handful of things. Because I know just as we get started here, there's potentially a lot of things to kind of get your head wrapped around in short order. A lot of you may have only had experience with the Windows operating system. And as far as relational database management systems are concerned, oftentimes they can run, don't get me wrong, they can indeed run on Windows. But more often than not, out in the real world, typically these systems usually run on Linux, and Linux is a different operating system from Windows. So you've already gone through the lab exercise of actually installing the Windows subsystem for Linux, or WSL as they call it. And in this case, we are going to go with the Ubuntu distribution. Without going too far down the rabbit hole on what exactly a Linux distribution is, but I'll talk about it just a little bit. Unlike Windows, and same thing with OS X or MacBooks, those are proprietary operating systems, and they're not open source. Now, parts of them are starting to become open source, or maybe they're using some open source components, but generally speaking, Windows and OS X are not what I would consider to be open source operating systems. Linux, on the other hand, is. Linux is entirely open source. And so what that means is that all the software, everything from the kernel all the way down to the desktop environments, to the different applications that you're running, everything is open source, meaning that you can actually get that source code and potentially modify it and recompile it and redistribute it. And that's kind of what a distro is. So a distro is a collection of various different pieces of software at various different points of time, and then they take and package them up. Now, Ubuntu, I think, is a pretty happy medium. Ubuntu is actually sponsored by Canonical, which is a company out of the UK. And they do a pretty nice job of balancing the mix of trying to continue to give you more features as development continues to move forward, but yet they still want to have some stability around it. So Ubuntu is a pretty happy medium when it comes to that. There are other Linux distros out there, but for the sake of our course, and of course the main focus of our coursework here is to learn about relational database management systems, but I did want to at least briefly talk about Linux as an operating system. So you'll notice here the Linux command prompt, of course, is different than your Windows command prompt. Now, for certain, if you've done any work for your other courses, you may have seen the Windows command prompt or the Bash prompt. The DOS prompts, people would call it, because back in the day it was just called MS-DOS. So there are some similarities as far as it is a text-only interface, but the commands are a little bit different. Some commands are shared, but a lot of them are indeed differently. So I'm going to take and close that. So when we launch it, we want to make sure we have the Ubuntu or the Linux command prompt, and you'll see that's indicated with the $sign here, and here's this. Now, as far as seeing what you're seeing here, this is your username, your Linux username. Now, keep in mind, the subsystem for Linux technically is a form of virtualization. So when we're inside of this black box here, you can almost think of this almost like a virtual machine. So what's happening inside of here, it is somewhat compartmentalized, but there are some differences between running a full out virtual machine versus running the Windows subsystem for Linux. Excuse me. And if we have time, maybe we'll get into that. But for right now, just understand that they're similar. Similar enough that you have to keep in mind that the login that you use to get into Windows, all right, so my Windows login, now it's sheer happenstance that my Windows login happens to be the same, just because I did that on purpose. But your Windows login is not going to necessarily be the same as your Linux login, all right? Now, probably the biggest thing to wrap your head around is all the different types of accounts. And that's the main reason why I wanted to do this screencast, is to kind of step you through all of that. So, of course, you have your Windows login to get you into your Windows desktop. Okay, fine. You launch your Linux and your Ubuntu or your Windows subsystem for Linux, or your Ubuntu, it gets opened up. Okay, fine. And then so here, right now, if I were to run the who am I command, which is all squished together, by the way, you'll see that right now, as far as Ubuntu is concerned, all right, I'm logged in as Broyles, which is the username that I set up. Now, your username is going to be different. It's whatever it was whenever you ran through the install process. Now, from here, if I were to do a command called sudo space su, All right, if I were to run that and I type in my password, and this is my Linux password, of course, which may be different than your Windows password. So again, keep things straight. You have your Windows login with your Windows password. Then you have your Linux login, all right, which when you launch it this way, it'll kick you right to the command prompt. But if you want to elevate yourself to the root account, you have to type in your Linux password, which is potentially different from your Windows password. So now you'll notice if I run who am I, I'm now running around as the root user. Now, I know this is potentially a lot to keep straight. The root user here is the root user for the Linux operating system, right? This is a different account than the root user of MariaDB or MySQL, right? That's the concept is the same. So basically the root account is the super account, or the Uber or the top admin account is the root account. They are different accounts. So this root is different from the MySQL root or the MariaDB root, and we'll get into that. All right, so how we can tell we're still on the Linux side of the house is, we have our command prompt. Here's the pound sign. You'll notice that it went from a $ to a pound sign, indicating that I am running around as the root user. This is just where I am in the file system. And again, some other nuanced differences. In Linux, there's no such thing as drives. So in Windows, you have C drive, D drive, E drive, F drive, whatever. In Linux, everything is a directory. Everything. Even if it's a network drive, it's mounted as a directory. So you're always going to see /something/something. And you also notice that the slashes are forward slashes and not backslashes. All these little nuance differences between the operating systems. And of course, we are the root account. Now, if I type exit, that will take me back. So now I'm downgrading my account to just my normal Linux account instead of the root account. Okay, now let's walk through the MySQL secure installation. Well, actually, we can walk through the whole installation process. So when you install and remove software in Linux, you have to use, in Ubuntu, you use the apt command. Now, the apt command requires you to run that as root. Now, in order to run a command as root, you can temporarily elevate your account to root if you prepend everything with sudo. So if I say sudo apt install MariaDB-server, that will temporarily elevate my normal Linux account to be running as a root account, which then would have privileges to install software. Now, because I've already ran sudo earlier in my demo here, I don't have to retype my password. But if you're popping into this and right away you're just going to type sudo apt install MariaDB server, of course you'll need to type in your Linux user password. And it'll take and install it. Now mine's already installed, and when it installs it, it already kicks it up and it's running. Now the next step is we want to walk through the secure installation process. Now you'll notice that in order to do that, the command is actually MySQL secure installation, with underscores in between the words. And you might be wondering, well, why is that? We installed MariaDB server, but why am I using a MySQL command on MariaDB server? That's not making much sense. So part of your homework for this week is to look into that. Why is that? Why is it are we using MySQL commands even though we're using the MariaDB database management system? So look into that. We'll run this thing. And then now I had already run this before, so I'm just going to go ahead and I already have root password. I do not want to switch to socket authentication, so put N for that. I already have a root count already set up, but I don't want to change my root password. But for you, if you're running it for the first time, you do want to set your root account. Now, this root account is a different root account than your Linux root account. This is the database system's root account. All right. So I actually have a separate password for my database system root account as opposed to my Linux root account. We do want to remove anonymous users. We do want to disallow remote login for root itself. I'll go into that later when we start talking about securing database systems. And yes, let's get rid of the test database. And yeah, let's reload the privilege tables. All right, so now we're good to go. Now, every once in a while, if you're used to DOS, you can see CLS, but here we actually type out clear, and that'll go ahead and reset the terminal window for us. And now I want to take and actually get into the MySQL, or actually the MariaDB prompt. And again, it's a little bit of an oddity. So you're like, why am I using the MySQL command to get into the MariaDB prompts? But again, look into that. So MySQL, and how are we logging into MySQL? We're going to do it as the root user. Now, this is the root user for MySQL. All right, this is the MySQL root user. And we need to say -p to prompt for password. I type in the root password that I set whenever I went through the secure installation process. And then now we're actually at the MariaDB prompt. Now, the MariaDB prompt is a totally different series of commands from your normal Linux prompt. So if you haven't really worked much with command line interfaces, this course, be patient with yourself and look into different tutorials just to kind of augment your own learning to get comfortable with it. But keep in mind, you have your Windows operating system, you have the Linux subsystem running on Windows, or WSL as they call it. In this case, we're running the Ubuntu distro. Once you launch that, you then have the Linux command line interface to kind of wrangle with. And then once you're past the Linux command line interface and you log into MariaDB, you then have the MariaDB command line interface to work with. So it's quite a bit. It's quite a bit of different command line interfaces. You'll get there. Key part is every once in a while, you may need to slow yourself down and ask, well, where am I? Who am I logged in as? And am I at the database system prompt? Am I at the Linux operating system prompt, or am I somewhere still on the Windows side of things? So where exactly am I? And again, it's not too tough. You just slow down, and every once in a while take a look at the prompt itself, and it kind of tells you exactly where you are. In this case, we're on the MariaDB prompt, and you'll notice that the commands are different. So if I type the word clear, nothing happens because the clear command doesn't mean anything to the database system. But if I were to get out of the database system and run the clear command, it does something. All right. So again, just to kind of demonstrate the difference, that the commands that you would run inside of the database system are a totally different set of commands that in contrast to what you would run at the Linux prompt. So go ahead and get back in here again. All right. Now, since we're here, keep in mind that when you're at the MariaDB command line interface, all commands must be terminated, or they must end with a semicolon. Otherwise, it doesn't know that the command is over. The reason it does that is because later on in the course, actually pretty very soon, we'll have very, very long commands that for legibility purposes, we'll take and have carriage returns in those commands just so we can read them easier. So MariaDB will be like, okay, well, just because you hit carriage return, it doesn't mean that the command isn't necessarily over. All right. So if I were to say, I don't know, show databases, for example. All right. You'll notice that that's a command. All right. If I hit enter, it's just putting more arrows because it's expecting like, okay, well, that's nice, but is that the end of the command or not? So in that case, we have to do a semicolon. And then it's like, oh, okay, that must be the end of the command that you want me to run. Now, again, this is different than the Linux command line interface. So these are all these little nuanced things that we'll have to practice and get comfortable with. But I at least wanted to do a screencast just to get you started here. At any point in time, you have any questions at all, please feel free to hop online. Go to the discussion threads. I'll always take and post a help thread for each lab exercise. So should you actually have any problems, you can go ahead and post a question there. Additionally, if you know how to get into Microsoft Teams, I'm usually always hanging out on Microsoft Teams, so you can always look me up there and hit me up there if you need help as well. All right, hopefully this is enough to at least give you some clarity on what's up with what. Again, not to sound like a broken record, but there are several different command line interfaces to worry about. You have your Windows login. Okay, fine. So I'm inside of Windows. So then I launch my Ubuntu interface. Okay, cool. So now that I'm here, this is technically the Linux command line interface, or some people would call it the bash prompt, or the born again shell. So now we're at the Linux command line interface, which has its own series of commands. And then if I want to go into my MariaDB instance, I would run the MySQL command. Right now, we're going to log in as the root user. Now, again, this is the database root user, and get into the database system. And now we're at the database command line interface.